Good afternoon. I'm Bob Schneider, the Executive Director of the New York State School Boards Association. Thank you for attending our first webinar in a three-part series of complimentary webinars hosted by NYSSBA. This three-part series focuses on equity and diversity and the huge part it plays in our students' educational opportunities and their future. Over 500 people have registered for this event, which includes 289 school districts around New York. That number tells me that this is such an important area for our members and ratifies what NYSSBA has been working on regarding equity and diversity and the effects it has on our students and society overall. Even before the pandemic, we have been very much involved in supporting and informing our school boards and superintendents about this issue. We continue up this path as we focus on equity and diversity across our entire organization and how we can change the direction of this important issue. We are involved at the national level. I serve on the National School Boards Association DIRE Task Force, which stands for Dismantling Institutional Racism in Education. And our work is in process, and we are developing more ways we can support our school boards, our superintendents, and communities as they continue to focus on this area moving forward. I would like to thank our sponsor for today, the Utica National Insurance Company, and the statement they asked me to read says it all as far as their alignment with our efforts here at the National School Boards Association. So I'm going to read that to you now. At Utica National, we share in NYSSBA's vision and values of helping to ensure gender, racial, and economic equality for all. It is upon all of us to support one another and create a society where everyone is truly equal. Together, we can be that change. In addition, I would like to mention at our upcoming convention, we have an educational strand completely focused on equity and diversity, and I hope you would join us and learn more about this most important issue and initiative that we are all working on as we move forward. That opening, once again, thank you for attending today, and I would like to throw it to our Director of Leadership Development, Darcy D'Arcole.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you to Utica National. I'm Darcy D'Arcole, Director of Leadership Development here at NYSSBA, and I'm joined today by my colleague and co-host, Mark Schneider, NYSSBA's Leadership Development Manager. So today we're going to be talking about the ongoing effort to create an educational experience that provides equitable opportunities and a sense of inclusivity among all students in New York State schools. But before we begin, I'd like to take a few moments to introduce and welcome our special guests who are joining us today. So first off, Dr. Lavelle Brown. Currently, Dr. Lavelle Brown is serving as the superintendent of Ithaca City School District in Ithaca, New York. Dr. Brown is an experienced educator who has held positions as a teacher, assistant principal, school CIO, and superintendent of schools. Dr. Brown has facilitated conversations in multiple communities that have resulted in transformative shifts in culture and achievement. Using systems thinking in schools, Dr. Brown's leadership has led to innovative programs, redesigned learning spaces, and numerous technology initiatives. Dr. Brown, we're so pleased that you're joining us today.
Thank you.
Next, we have Mr. Michael Jaime, who is the president of the Caucus of Black School Board Members, and I am pleased to say he serves as their representative here on the New York State School Boards Association Board of Directors. Mr. Jaime is also president of the Elmont Board of Education and is the vice president for the Sewanaka Board of Education. For the past several years, Mr. Jaime has been involved with the National School Boards Association's Advocacy Institute and mentors New York City high school students through his involvement with iMentor.org and the Virtual Enterprise International. In addition, he also participates in the Education Equity Initiative sponsored by Erase Racism in Syosset, New York. Michael, we're delighted to have you participate in today's discussion.
Thank you.
And finally, we have Dr. Oliver Robinson, currently serving as the Superintendent of Schools for the Shenendehowa Central School District and is the President-elect of the New York State Council of School Superintendents. He also serves as adjunct faculty for the University at Albany and the College of St. Rose. Prior to Dr. Robinson's current positions, he served as the Superintendent of Schools for the Mohonasen Central School District. Dr. Robinson is very engaged with various professional associations and community-related groups and is a strong advocate for children and educational achievement. Dr. Robinson is a leader for learning, a staunch advocate for equity, and for equal access to educational opportunities for all children. And Dr. Robinson, thank you for taking your time to be part of this webinar today. I also want to share with you what my colleagues in the Policy Services Department have been working on. As part of NYSSBA's commitment to educational equity, diversity, and inclusivity, NYSSBA's Policy Services, in conjunction with the Diversity and Inclusivity Commission of the New York State Council of Superintendents, has recently developed a sample board policy, along with a sample administrative regulation and exhibit to aid boards and superintendents who wish to engage in this important work. If your district has subscribed to the NYSSBA's Policy Update Service, you received these materials at the end of September. However, all NYSSBA members will receive the same materials at the end of October. Our policy staff will co-host a separate complimentary webinar with representatives from the NYSSBA's Commission to review the equity policy materials in more depth. Details will be forthcoming about this webinar, and I hope you will join us. So, earlier you heard Bob mention that equity and inclusivity in education are important for many reasons. And I believe all of us here today, whether it be as a speaker or as an attendee, recognize these initiatives are something we can all get behind. So when we talk about equity and inclusivity, we are essentially saying we want every student to be successful. When we're at the board table discussing what's happening in our schools, we want to be sure we understand what it actually means to provide equitable opportunities and a feeling of inclusivity in our schools. And this kind of awareness is crucial to the success of all our students. So that being said, equity and inclusivity in education is a concept worth defining. And I think I'd like to ask my colleague, Mark Schneider, to get us started with our first question to Dr. Robinson. So Mark?
Thank you, Darcy. Now, there is a wealth of information and, more importantly, misinformation available on the topic of equity and inclusion in education. So our first discussion question will provide an opportunity to identify the facts and dispel some of the misconceptions of the issue. And specifically, Dr. Robinson, what does equity and inclusivity in education mean? And can you tell us what it looks like?
Thanks, Mark, for that. So let me just couch my comment from 3 lenses: why, what, and how. And the why piece becomes important because it starts with the fundamental belief that if our schools are to truly be sanctuaries for learning for all students, the notion of equity and inclusivity should be a natural outgrowth, should be a part of the fabric of the school system if we fundamentally believe in that why as schools being sanctuary for learning. So let me go to the what piece of it. So Darcy alluded to earlier that when we start talking about equity, we're not only talking about equity and opportunities, we're also talking about equity and outcomes. Oftentimes people talk about, well, we offer this program. However, offering it and students taking advantage of it is 2 different things. And so therefore we can't separate equity and opportunities from the outcome portions of it. So when we start talking about educational equity, we're talking about ensuring that all students have equal access to courses, to teachers, but more importantly, to school environments that speak to their needs, to speak to their circumstances, that validate their experiences, regardless if it's race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, gender preferences, that speaks to those type things. And so from a process piece, it also then speaks to the question of what decisions are being made. Decisions about how resources are being allocated within schools. Decisions about options that students have, programs, extracurricular opportunities that students have. Are those things being provided to students in such a manner that they're taking advantage of those things? And are we really gauging and measuring those pieces? So the why piece is important in terms of if we fundamentally believe schools are sanctuaries for learning for all students, and then the what in terms of our objective is to ensure that we have those environments where kids can thrive regardless of their circumstances. And so let me just take that one step further, that this is more than just an academic exercise. So what that means is that boards and superintendents must really then have an appreciation, if you will, of students. You know, there's a whole adage saying that every child wants to know that someone knows my name. And so when you think about that very statement, if you know someone's name, there's a personalization to that. And so therefore, once you know my name, you have to make a choice in terms of how you prioritize my needs. And so it really does start from systems that know the names of kids, have an appreciation of who they are, and subsequently then focus on eliminating those institutional barriers that lends to those disparate outcomes. And we see it in discipline, we see it in academics, we see it in participation. And so how do we do those type things? And I'll just end on this piece of it, that it's more than just having celebrations or having notion of where we tolerate this. It's beyond that. It's truly fundamentally taking those action steps that provide equitable opportunities. And by definition, by the way, equity means treating differences differently. In other words, if I need more, you should provide more so that I can have a similar outcome as everyone else. And unfortunately, we see oftentimes in our systems that the people who get more are the people who have quote unquote political clout, or quite frankly, already have privileges as a result of who they are. So that's why we can't separate equity and opportunities from the outcome component.
And thank you, Dr. Robinson. Just to follow up on that, and you inspired me a memory of a recent conversation I had with a school board who were equating equity with equality, saying that everyone has the same opportunities, everyone has the same resources. Could you speak just for a moment about the differences between equity and equality and the impact that has on our students?
You know, Mark, that's like the statement I often hear people who don't want to address issues of racism by saying I'm colorblind. The reality of this, no one is colorblind. The color of our skin as we walk into the space dictate people's perceptions and bring out those biases. So again, it's one of those nice statements that people use to rationalize away or rationalize actions that perpetuate privileges. Because the bottom line is, if you and I are together, and I have a certain whatever, let's make it simple. I have a particular disability, something that needs to be compensated for, and you give both of us the same thing. By that very nature, I'm still going to be behind. And so subsequently, when you start measuring our outcomes, you say, why is that student still behind? They got the same thing as the other student. Guess what? Because they needed more. And that's the reason why within our systems, we try to structure from both ends of the horizon. Students who have to make up additional deficits, as well as students who we have to challenge. So if you have a student that needs to be challenged and you're only giving the students what quote unquote an average experience, that student is also going to fall behind, just using a very simple example. So I think it's an unfortunate thing that people use those words interchangeably. And unfortunately, that interchangeable use of those words lend to faulty policies and faulty decision making. And we have to think about, how do we ensure that services are truly following needs? How do we first understand the needs? And the needs, it means understanding our students, understanding our student population, and not generalizing. And I just end this last piece of it. It's almost like the same thing we sometimes do with grades. We say averaging, put everything in the middle. And we don't recognize the significance of the individuality that goes with the effort that goes into a particular initiative.
Great, thank you, Dr. Robinson. I'm also wondering if Dr. Brown can also speak to this question of the definition of equitable and perhaps some of the unique barriers or challenges that Dr. Brown, you're seeing at Ithaca and/or elsewhere. I do know that, you know, it's different in different districts, but tell us a little bit about what you think this definition is about and what you're seeing in regard to some of these barriers.
Thank you for the question, and thank you for all of those who made it possible for this honor to be here today. You know, in our school community, we've had to define equity, and it's come through a significant amount of community engagement and a wonderful Board of Education. Our communities are the boards in our schools, and our schools are the community. And until we come up with a common mental model and definition for equity, we will be spinning wheels, and there will be controversies. In our school community, and I'm here, I've survived the superintendency for 10 years because of an outstanding board. And together we've defined equity. It is about reducing the predictability of who achieves and who fails. We can look at our data across the country, and we can pretty much predict who's going to achieve and who's going to fail. And most times, it's the young people of color and those living in poverty. We need to reduce that predictability. We also need to interrupt the practices that we know are negatively impacting young people, particularly those from diverse settings every day. Our implicit and explicit biases, our policies, the ways in which we allocate resources, we know have been inequitable. And until we're willing and able and courageous enough to stand up and interrupt that, we've done nothing. And it's also in our community, we've defined equity by saying we will cultivate the unique gifts and talents of every young person. And that means something to us. We're going after 100% graduation rates. We want all of our young people to get the best stuff, our STEM courses, our highest level courses, our best educators. We want everyone to have that opportunity so that their gifts and talents are cultivated. So when we're asked about equity, and I'm asked about equity every day, I respond with, and our board will respond with, what part? Because you got to be thinking about it in different ways and at different levels.
Great, thank you. And Michael, I know you're a board member, and I know that you talk to a lot of parents out there. And, you know, if a parent came to you and said, you know, so tell me more about, you know, equity and equal. And I think there are misconceptions, like we've mentioned a little while ago, about what it means to have equitable and the difference between equal. And we used to talk a lot about equal opportunities, of course, when I was going to school, but that doesn't necessarily make it fair for all students. So if you were talking to a parent, how might you explain the difference between equitable and equal?
So I'd like to actually thank the sponsors as well for this opportunity and the opportunity to serve as a panelist with these two great educators here, Dr. Brown and Dr. Robinson. I've known them for a number of years, and they've been a total inspiration to myself and a lot of my colleagues across the state. And so it's an honor and a privilege to be on this panel. And so a lot of times how I approach it with parents, and I try and you know, take it back to something that's probably innate to them if they have more than one child. So, you know, if you have more than one child, I have 3. And so I know that there's strengths and weaknesses. And so based on that knowledge that I have about each and every one of my children, you know, I approach them with a certain tactic in order to get the outcome that I'm looking for. And so I usually talk to parents and tell them, you know, you have to know your child's limitations. And as well, you have to, you know, very early on in a game, have conversations with your teachers, your child's teachers as well, to know the teacher's strengths and weaknesses as well. Once you can, I think, strike a balance between your child's strengths and weaknesses and your teacher or your school district's strengths and weaknesses, you actually have now given yourself the tools in which you know what you have to do to kind of help your school district, help your child, as well as helping your child on your own. So I definitely believe that, you know, in order to achieve equality, and that it has to be a community effort. On one hand, you know, the Board of Education needs to, like Dr. Brown and Robinson says, they have to take the data and look at the outcomes that they're getting, and go back and ask, why are we getting these outcomes? And more than likely, I think a lot, and from my 14-year experience, a lot of times the outcomes are because there are implicit biases, and there are barriers that are set in place to prevent a lot of children from achieving what they really need to achieve based on their interests. Just take, for example, you know, a lot of districts have in place, you know, where a child that is wanting to take an AP course has to get a recommendation from a teacher. If the child doesn't have that type of relationship, like Dr. Robinson said, you know, if a teacher doesn't know that child's name, that teacher will probably be not willing to grant that recommendation. And so those are the types of barriers that we have to remove to get that equality that we're looking for.
Mm-hmm. And I think we'll end this first topic with a question that I've received quite frequently over the last few months, as you know, calls for social justice have been, you know, part of the mainstream news media, and it's been front page news for the past several months. We hear from districts that perhaps don't have a very diverse student population, and they ask, why is this important for us? We don't have that rich mixture of students, that rich mixture of staff. Why should we care? Why is this something that we need to put into our district as well? And I'll open that question up to any of you. Is what is the response that should be given to districts that may not necessarily have a diverse population or diverse representation?
I think it's important, if I may, for folks to think a bit deeper. This is not just about race. This is about culture, religion, class, nationality, ethnicity. The rings of culture really don't speak to race, which is an illusion. And when I'm asked to come into schools that say they have very little diversity, to talk about equity and inclusion, I tend to go early and sit in the front office. And you go 10 or 15 minutes early, you will see all of the young people in that particular school who aren't being served. And they tend to come from backgrounds that are not consistent with the dominant culture in that school. Whether it's, they're coming from a different zip code or a street in that particular community. So I ask folks, everyone has a significant amount of diversity in their school buildings. And I'm asking folks, I'm begging folks to think about this notion of diversity and equity in a different way, and not always about race. And I think that will liberate us as educators and us as schools to really take on this issue that has been plaguing us for centuries.
So Mark, if you don't mind, just want to piggyback on Lavelle's response, which I appreciate Lavelle starting it where he did. And even if we were to go to the elementary misconception that this conversation is about race, here's another gross misconception that people have, that the only people that have race are Black people. And which I think is so funny, because the only time you hear a conversation about race is when people are talking about Black people, as if no one else has a racial identity, which is the funny part of this whole conversation, right? So I always want people to think about it and say, okay, so if I am the only person that attributed to a race, what does that make you? And all of a sudden people think, oh, okay, so you're non-racial. So that's an interesting concept to think of. And let me punctuate this with a story. I was privileged to speak to a bunch of school board members and superintendents in a neighboring county, very rural county, and similar thing came up. And this was at a local community colleges where the students in the culinary program were providing the meals. So prior to the start of the program, all the students were being introduced, their names and where they were from. And if there were 20 students out of 18 of the 20 students, the large majority from New York City or downstate, so to speak, a young lady from Denmark, and a single young lady from that community. And I thought it was so telling. So I used that story to kick off my comments to that group to say, all these young people who are here right now in this rural community, they're from someplace else. Your kids who are in this rural community are going to be someplace else. And so when we put that into perspective, that it's not about where we are, it's where our young people are going and opportunities that we have for our young people that we're trying to prepare our young people for in a very global society. So that's one perspective. And the last perspective, at the end of the day, it's about humanity. It's about recognizing the simple respect for humanity. So anyone who wants to say that I have respect for myself, but I don't see the importance of having respect for someone else, I question that person's character to be even involved in our business and education. So this is truth telling in the sense that as Board of Education members, as administrators, we have to start from that very simple premise. Are we truly in the business of preparing our young people for all the possibilities that exist in front of them? Or are we so jaded by our own biases and experiences that we're going to hamstring them before they even get an opportunity to start running the race of life?
I think that's an excellent point, Dr. Robinson. And it does start with humanity, and it does start with a respect for all our differences, knowing who we are, right? Knowing our own race, our own culture, and being respectful for others. And I'll just tell this very short story, and then we're going to move on to our second question. But, you know, when we talk about other communities that might be less diverse, and the question, as Mark presented, you know, why is it important for them? And you hit it right on the head. We are trying to prepare our kids to be ready for a global community, for a community that involves so many differences and so many people coming from different walks of life. I'll just tell you, my son went to college right locally in Buffalo, at the University of Buffalo, and he had different roommates for his first 3 years that he was in the dormitory, and every year he had roommates from a different country, a different nationality, from China, from Turkey, from Korea. You know, he came from a community that was not very diverse, and he was suddenly thrown into living with kids from very different cultures. And he navigated well, I have to say. I'm very proud of him. But all of our kids who don't experience a lot of diversity when they're growing up are suddenly going to find themselves in a very different kind of environment, and they need to be prepared for that. So I think you've spoken very well to that point, and I just think this little story just reiterates that our children are going into a very global world. So I want to take us to our second question. And Mark, would you like to set us up with that?
Sure. Thanks, Darcy. And thank you all for the overview of the issue, as well as the discussion of the importance of equity and inclusivity in education. But now I think I'd like to look a little bit more internally at our schools. And Dr. Brown, I'll start with you with this question. What needs to change to make our districts more inclusive and equitable? And what practices are districts currently employing to be more responsive to the equity and inclusivity needs of their students and communities?
Well, thank you for the question, Mark. And again, I'm humbled to be here. I'm learning so much from Michael and Oliver. And I could go on for hours on this particular topic, but I'm going to share the air. I would say, you know, it does start with the meaningful engagement in the community. And I talked about that earlier. Without a community engaged in conversations about equity and inclusion, and a board leading the way like mine is, this does not happen. People like me can't have conversations about real equity and survive it without a significant amount of community engagement and the support of an outstanding board. And secondly, I would point to, you know, social emotional learning. You know, that's been coming up a lot here the last few years. And what I'm seeing, unfortunately, is that folks are deconnecting social emotional learning from the social political context our young people are growing up in. We know that our young people have better social emotional health when they are engaged in conversations about power and control, and they feel like they have power and control over their environments. What we've done is we have not engaged our young people in conversations about systemic oppression, racism, classism, sexism. And without that context, we are implementing social emotional learning programs. And as my good friend Dina Simmons would say, that's nothing but white supremacy with a smile. So I'm asking folks to let's engage in helping our young people develop social emotional health, helping them to be stronger and connected to the work that they want to solve. In our school district, we have what we call an anti-marginalization curriculum. And every young person from pre-K through end of course high school is engaging in solving a real world problem. And they've told us they want to solve issues around race and oppression and marginalization. So we built curriculum around having them engage in a transdisciplinary approach to solving those problems that's inquiry-based, it's connected to our standards, and they're having real dialogue about the issues that mean so much to them and that is impacting their lives every day. That's real work. We also, we're serious about culturally responsive teaching practices. We talked about those rings of culture. What we know is every one of our classrooms, whether it's 10 young people in there socially distanced or if it's 30 in a virtual classroom, there's a significant amount of diversity that exists in that space. And it's up to us as educators to engineer an environment and an opportunity where we're responsive to the various cultural needs. Now that's hard work. We know that work is hard, it's different from what we've done, it's not natural, but we must do it to be responsive to our young people. And that's work that our boards and our communities need to invest in because it takes years to do. So again, I could talk about this for hours, but I would just point to two things that are oftentimes being misunderstood and misrepresented from my perspective. And I think in many ways, allowing school districts to perpetuate the oppressive systems that we've always had. Social emotional learning, without the social political context, it's not going to allow for us to be inclusive and culturally responsive. And us just saying we're going to use culturally responsive practices without changing our instructional practices in a real way to be responsive to all the cultural needs, yet again will perpetuate oppressive systems. So I will start there, but again, starting with meaningful engagement in the community and with the Board of Education that understands this and can speak to it, as well as the superintendent or anyone else in the organization.
So, Mark, if you don't mind, so Lavelle and I, we're often confused. We've been on panels where people have had my name under his and his name under mine. But I say all the time, while we are two handsome looking fellows, we're very much different in many ways. However, the one thing that we do have in common is that we do come from a place where appreciation of what needs to go and happen in our schools is very similar. So I just wanted to if you want to capsulize, if you will, some of the things that Lavelle said, which I think is a very important point, that there needs to be an awareness that what happens in our schools to perpetuate their marginalization, that racism, the discrimination that we see is systemic and it's covert. And here's a key part of it. It's baked into the organizational culture. So in many ways, people who are part of the system don't even know it because it's baked into the culture of the school. And so it's great that people say that they're against something, but it's a moot point if your actions do not demonstrate what you're for. You hear all the time, well, I'm against this. Okay, that's great, but I'm not that concerned about that. I'm concerned about what you're for and what actions are you taking to promote those things that you're for. So that's one point I want to put a pin in, so to speak. And the second piece of it too is that, we started having this conversation about data before, that what's tracked, measured, and communicated. Tracked, measured, and communicated is often what we're likely to achieve. And so when we start having these equity conversations, the question I have asked people is like, how are you tracking it? How are you measuring it? How are you communicating it? Because if those things aren't happening, those things aren't achieved. So contrast that with right now, everyone complaining about the 3-8 test because we're talking about is it going to be in person, out of person. But the reality of it is every school district every year prepare those kids for those assessments, regardless of their perspective on it, because those things are tracked, measured, and communicated. And so in the same vein, then back to your question, Mark, those are the things that we have to do, but we just can't stop at the data. We have to unpack and appreciate the nuances. And this can't be one of those command and control approaches where we check off the many do's and then we check off the many don'ts and then we add them together and come up with a number. And if it's above par, we say we're doing great. It's not a command and control approach to it. It's really about how do we then look at decisions through an equity lens. looking at those decisions being very intentionally inclusive in terms of what's the impact, what's the implication, and it's not also who's included. The bigger question is who's not. And oftentimes that's the question we don't ask, who's not included as a result of this decision. And so it does then lend to the fact that as policymakers, as educators, as teachers, that we have to fundamentally come back to that notion that we have to believe in every child. We have to believe in every child, and every child is truly a gift. And so I think it really comes back to those type things. Again, just to punctuate a few of the point that my colleague Lavelle so clearly articulated.
Yeah, so gentlemen, if we break this down into its lowest denominator here, what does a socially responsive classroom look like? I mean, how is it different from the traditional classroom that we all grew up with, the classes that we attended when we were all in primary and secondary school? What are we really changing, and what are we really? What is the goal if we're talking about culturally responsive teaching and culturally responsive learning? What does it look like?
Different, I will start with, and I would also, before getting to that answer, one must need to understand different cultures. Let's just compare individualistic cultures with collective cultures. I'm coming from a very collective culture, but our schools, the dominant culture is the one that's very individualistic. And from my culture, no one achieves unless everyone achieves. That's not the school culture. The school culture is based on sorting and selecting and competition versus cooperation. I'm from a culture that appreciates calling and respond. I'm a Southern Baptist. I go to Southern Baptist Church every Sunday like Oliver does. And we call and respond. It's very communal, collective. That's not you call out in a traditional classroom, you get sent to the office when you look like me. Yeah. My culture appreciates verbal overlap. In this house, if you don't interrupt someone when they're talking, you're not gonna get the conversation.
Uh-oh, we lost him.
Lavelle, we lost you. We can't hear you.
I think we lost your audio, Lavelle. So we'll see if our tech people can fix that with you.
So
But
I
yeah,
would
can
agree.
you talk again? Are you back?
I was on a roll too, but I'll just stop. Go ahead, Oliver.
You were great. You were great. I think your distinction is really important, is that different cultures have different ways of being, and our culture in schools may not necessarily lend themselves to this cooperative, inclusive nature in which children would feel free to really bring their best talents forward, etc. So talk a little bit more, Lavelle, if you can, about so how would you change it? Mark said, what does it really look like? So what might it really look like if you could describe it a little bit?
Yeah, and it starts with us unpacking our own individual and collective and our organizational biases to get there, to get to the instructional practice shifts that I'm referencing now. We need to do a lot of reflection work and mindset work ourselves. Why is it important to be responsive to the different cultural needs? That's a conversation, and that's a place where we all need to start, because not every educator feels like we need to be. Many actually feel like young people should be assimilating into the dominant culture and giving up who they are in order to navigate it successfully. The folks on this call, Oliver, I don't want to speak for you or you, Michael, but I know I've had to assimilate to be successful in the academic situations that I've been put in. I've had to colonize my language so that I don't offend folks. So as educators, we need to reflect on, do we want our young people to assimilate into the environment or thrive in our environment? And if so, how do we change our instructional approaches to allow for them to thrive in that environment? Now that will change everything from the literature we put in front of them, to the ways in which we ask them to move around in the classroom, to even how we grade. Do we grade in collective cultures, particularly on a 100-point scale that is intended to sort and select? So I could go on and on, but everything about our organization is built on a culture that, quite frankly, is not responsive to the diverse needs and the population that we say we need to do better with.
So an interesting point, Darcy, just want to add an interesting point here in my district, we're in the process now of studying equitable grading practices. And it's interesting because some of the resistance, and I use that word comes from the fact that people are so accustomed to how they were graded, what was beneficial to them, and ask the question is, if it's not broken, why should we fix it? And so my answer is often, well, it's depends on how we measure if it's broken or not. Broken for whom, or beneficial or disadvantaged for whom. And so those, that's we talking about how does it look different? I think, Mark, the question is, what's the question are we asking? And so when we even look at the experience of young people, you know, what is school truly about? Is it truly about helping students foster a sense of agency, a sense of being learners? Or is it truly about kids learning to play the game of school, know that if I do certain things right, I would get a higher grade than not? And so what does it look like? It looks like a place where, quite frank with you, that students' capacity is respected. It looks like a place where opportunities for students to engage how they can is embraced. It looks like a place where, quite frank with you, the end result is not about me having a nice bell curve score with my grades, but a place where kids, when the end of the day or the end of the semester, they don't want to leave because it was such a engaging experience for them. And good teachers, by the way, we have a lot of good teachers in our system do that. The question is, how do we systematize that? And it doesn't come from mandated training. So for board members who are on the call thinking that we're going to go out and mandate culture responsive teaching, I'm going to tell you what you're going to get. You're going to get a half-ass effort at the end of it by a lot of people who don't appreciate the why, and then you mandate me to do something. I don't even appreciate the why. So it has to be about how do we create the cultures within our schools and within our community, an equity imperative by having those conversations that Lavelle alluded to before, by saying, why is this even important to all of us before we start worrying about how we do it? Because if we don't have an appreciation of that, folks, we're again throwing good money after bad and frustrating the process that is truly the gateway for the success or the increased success of many students. And so this conversation is vitally important, but more important, the steps that we take to execute it is equally important.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. And I think, you know, what I'm really hearing you say is that if we really believe in the why, then we really have to consider a paradigm shift for how we educate our kids. And it is a much bigger picture, is, you know, what I'm gathering, if I could just take it and summarize it a little bit, is we really do want to create the imperative, you know, the why question, and we really do need to think about perhaps a paradigm shift in how we educate so all kids can thrive. And I'm thinking particularly about your comment about, you know, the kid who knows I'm just going to play the game to get through is not really thriving in that kind of environment. They're just kind of going along. They're doing what is expected of them. They're complying, but they're not really bringing forward their best talent. And we need to really pay attention to that. And I'm kind of curious, Michael, I know you work a little bit with kids and high schoolers in New York, and if you could bring forward into this conversation some of the things that maybe you're hearing from some of those high school students that you're talking to, you know, what are they saying about education today? What's their experience been like in the school educational experience? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Sure. So, you know, it's very funny. A lot of people take kids for granted, what they think, how they feel. And these kids, no matter what background they come from, they're very sharp. And they know whether or not the person or persons standing in front of them care about them or not. And that a lot of times drives their effort. And like Dr. Robinson was saying, you know, you'll have some of those kids that know exactly what to do. You know, they go along to get along. And they are the ones that will, you know, leave our public education systems and go on to college and thrive, because they know what type of, you know, society we live in today. and globally they know how to get along as well. But again, it's that population of students that don't have that that knowledge, that we're not helping to foster, you know, appreciation of education, and actually to come back into the education world and provide that diversity that a lot of school districts across New York State are looking for. You know, I often have a lot of school board members call me or email me asking me, well, what can I do to attract teachers of diverse backgrounds to my district? And, you know, I often ask them, well, you know, do you have a policy that talks about that? Is your board talking about that? Does your board even consider the impact of what a diverse candidate would do for your student body? And a lot of times they haven't even begun those types of conversations. And I think that's where, you know, all of our students are failing, because they're not getting that diverse background that they need to, you know, go out into the global society. You know, I think everybody loves to travel, you know, from social media post pre-pandemic. You know, you can go on Instagram or Facebook any day and you see glorious pictures of people traveling about the world. And I think in order to have that appreciation, you have to have been introduced to, you know, the benefits of traveling and exploring different cultures and different races. So I think that's primarily what, you know, school districts need to focus on. They need to be more student-centric in teaching and policies, in order to, you know, break those, you know, this is the way we've always done it and it's worked. But, you know, we all know from looking at and analyzing the data that that's not always the case. So, you know, again, just taking it back to your original question, I think students are really looking for us to change their learning environments and make them different. And just going back to a point that Dr. Robinson made about the humanity of it, you know, for folks that don't appreciate the humanity part of it, let's talk about the economic part of it. So if all our students were successful and went out and, you know, obtain those jobs that are hard to fill, that will go on for, you know, and those jobs that haven't even been created today, our economy would be so much stronger. And a lot of us wouldn't be talking about state aid cuts and, you know, how to pay Peter and Rob Paul to fund our programs that we're looking to improve our educational programs.
Thank you, Michael. I want to put another layer on this conversation, because it has been part of our conversation for the past only going on 6 months now, and that is the COVID pandemic and how it has added a whole nother layer of impact to this question of equitable education. And so I'm wondering if, I'll throw it out to anybody who wants to speak to it, but tell us a little bit about, you know, what your experience has been thus far, and your thoughts about it, and, you know, what you're hoping for to turn that around. So Oliver?
I'll just kick the conversation off with I think it was Malcolm X that says that the chicken has come home to roost. But by that I mean COVID has unveiled some of the gross inequities that exist within our school communities, that it was easy for us to ignore, because we only saw kids within the confines of our school buildings. And in many cases, we didn't even pay attention to them close enough to understand and appreciate them. And so when you think about when we pivoted to an all virtual environment, not only were we going into kids' homes, but kids were coming into our homes. And so the human nature of those relationships were front and center. And that became an obvious piece of it. So forget about the issues we have with broadband and technology and the lack of, and we could talk about those academic things forever. The reality of it is, it's the human piece of it that became so very real, And it became very telling. And I just give you a quick story. A colleague shared with me that a teacher said, "Oh my God, I was surprised that so-and-so father was there supporting him." And the colleague said, "So why were you surprised that that child's father was there?" And the conversation stopped because that person's premise was based upon this Black young man didn't have a father in the household, because before that, there was the assumption that was made. Another colleague said, "Oh my God, I was surprised that so-and-so's house is so nice." And again, all those comments, while they're very ignorant and kind of, quite frank with you, harsh when you think about it, the reality of it is COVID brought many of those things to a head and forced all of us to have that very authentic, sincere conversation about, do we really know our kids? Do we really appreciate their backgrounds and their circumstances? But more importantly, do we realize the power of us as educators and the difference that we can make in the lives of our kids? And so that's, for me, that's what COVID has done, has took off that veil of ignorance that so many of us carry around with us and don't realize it. But more importantly, it also provided us a great opportunity to say, now in education, we can truly become that equalizer. We can truly make the difference for every young people. And we have seen, I'm sure Lavelle could comment on it, we have seen young people who suffered grossly in our schools are thriving in a virtual environment. And you ask the question, why? And so those are some of the things. So again, I'm not going to go into we need more broadband, we need more this. Those are logistical things. We can solve all the logistical problems, but if we don't address those fundamental human dynamics, the biases that happens within our system, we would just have those great logistics and we'll still perpetuate those same type things.
See, here we go. See, Oliver said it. We're gonna get started now. He said no more academic conversations. We're gonna have an authentic one. Oliver, I have asked that question. Why are young people thriving in the virtual environment? The same young people that we say we need to do better for in person or in our schools. And they're telling me why. When I asked them, I called them, particularly the young men who look like me and whom I mentor all over the country. And they tell me, yeah, for the first time, I'm not going into a space where people are looking to send me to the office. I haven't been suspended. I haven't been sent out of class. I haven't had someone say something just so racist and oppressive to me in an implicitly biased way in months. And they will also go so far as to say, I'm looking around and on the walls in this space I'm in right now, I see images of myself. I see myself represented on the walls. I see myself represented in the literature I'm reading. They're reading Essence magazine, Ebony magazine, Black Panther comics like they're reading in my house. I'm looking at media that represents my culture. The Black Panther's been played 900 times since March 13th in my house. And my little guy's picking up on the food, the clothing, the accents, the ways in which they collaborate. You see, the question we should be asking is, how are we going to get them to come back? How are we going to get the young people that we've marginalized and failed? And we're saying now we're going to reimagine education and give voice and choice to young people. What is that going to look like? Because the young people I'm talking to say it needs to fundamentally change to be much more like the environment that they're sitting in right now virtually that's culturally responsive.
Great. And Michael, are you hearing that too from some of the young people and at your board of education in Elmont and Sewanaka?
Absolutely. So I've heard some stories where some students that were successful were not as successful because they missed the structure of the classroom. But I'm hearing more students that are actually thriving for the very same reasons that Dr. Brown is talking about, that the environment is one in which they feel comfortable to learn and which they're thriving. And it's because they're, within the confines of their home, they're surrounded by their family and sometimes extended family in the home. These are the things that we need to think about when we are able to fully reopen and bring all children back. How are the classrooms going to be different? How are teachers going to be more responsive to students as individuals as opposed to, a group or a race? It's very important to, I think, take a step back. I think a lot of us need to take a step back and look at, the lessons learned in terms of what good leadership is, and how a good leader adapts and moves in a direction that's beneficial to, everybody in for example, a principal, taking, reopening the building, what's important to every single person that's going to cross that threshold to make sure that they feel comfortable and safe in the environment that we are in. One of the things that, struck me was that, how we have virtually had, since COVID closed a lot of the schools, there were no school shootings, and there were, no kids that were basically virtually suspended. So we have to look at why these things were happening, and really address the needs of the children, and ask ourselves, are the decisions that we're making on a day-to-day basis, are they beneficial to students, or are they just beneficial to the adults in the buildings and in the districts? So I think, we need to take this time to make sure that we're providing all students with, with literature, with pictures that are representative of not only the school culture, but the community culture. Again, I think going back to engaging the community and learning about what is important to the community versus what's important to the school, and the school's numbers, I think is important, and just really driving it back to making sure that, we're addressing the high achievers, and we're making sure that we're moving the low achievers even further along than what we've done in the past.
Yeah, and Mr. Jaime, I think that's a nice segue into our third topic, as we really do address the call to action that we're looking for here. And prior to coming to NYSSBA, I myself was a board member. And in my time on the school board, our district had a vision that touched every aspect of its work. And the vision is, it's an equity vision that race, ethnicity, disability, gender, zip code are not going to be determining factors in our students' education. And in fact, my work on the board is what really opened my eyes to the inequities that can exist in educational systems and have inspired my research and my work in the field. Now, we've heard that the overview of the issue, we've heard strategies and tools that districts can employ to be more proactive, but let's now take a moment to speak directly to our target audience, board members. And Mr. Jaime, I wonder if you'll start by speaking about the role of the school board in building a district that fosters equity and inclusivity.
Sure. So I would first say that, to all the board members out there that are doing this work already, I commend you, and I'm here to support you, as well as NYSSBA. NYSSBA is here with a lot of information, and the Superintendent's Association is out there as well doing a lot of this work. So, continue to do the work and continue to feel supported. I know sometimes it can be very frustrating because certain board members don't appreciate it as much as you do, but continue that work, because the benefactors of the work that we're all doing definitely appreciate it. Especially, I had my board meeting last night, and although we couldn't all gather together, the school district and the schools within my community celebrated the school board virtually, and kids did poems, they did drawings of various school board members, and they also sang a song. So even in a virtual environment, the students appreciate what you're doing. To my school board members that don't feel that this work is important, it is. It's very important. Dr. Robinson, Dr. Brown have devoted many years to giving this message and going across the state, from the northern part of the state to I know out in Suffolk, Long Island. So I appreciate the work that they're doing, and this work is very important. As I said before, you know, if you're not going to take into consideration the humanity part of it, let's take into consideration the economic part of it. So about maybe 2 years ago, I attended a forum on Long Island about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as a region, you know, it was said that Long Island is losing $24 billion a year because of the lack of embracing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So again, you know, this is, you know, we United States of America touts itself as an economic engine, but how can we truly be an economic engine if we're leaving a part of our population out of that engine? So I implore you that this work is very important. You know, taking it back to the board, what can the board do? The board needs to, first of all, they need to be courageous. They need to be authentic. And last but not least, they need to, you know, I always say that when I make a decision, the first thought is about the student and the last thought is about the student, and everything else in between doesn't really matter so long as that outcome doesn't adversely impact the student, doesn't adversely impact the community. So, you know, again, I think it's about making sure that your policies and your procedures within the district are reflective of, you know, how you want your district to portray itself to the general community, because, you know, people choose where to live based upon not only you know you know the area, but on how well the school district does. So I think it's imperative to all of us to make sure that our school districts are making sure that we're culturally responsive in our delivery of the education materials, that we are you know, we are talking about the biases that are in place already, and trying to, you know, stamp those biases out, and making sure that the systematic things that have been in place year after year are basically broken down, and to remove the barriers for hiring, and to also remove the barriers for kids succeeding. So I think that's the very most important work that school boards need to be focusing on.
Thank you. Thank you, Michael. And one of the things I also heard Dr. Brown, Lavelle, you said earlier is, you know, partly where this starts is the conversation with the community. And I would love it if you would talk more about that very important piece, is how do you start that conversation with the community when you think of it in the context of, you know, our board members are out there. They're a very important part of the community. They're the linkage between the community and the Board of Education, which has so much influence around where the district goes and what, you know, comes up as important strategies to move the district in the way that you want to move it. But the linkage back to the community is really, really important. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how you start that conversation and engage the community from where you stand.
Well, thanks for asking that question. And I can't brag enough about the Board of Education in Ithaca. It's a very diverse group that represents the community. And they've made a very public commitment to being a governance team that would go after these issues. And they are doing it through policy. They've committed, Dr. Sean F. Bradwell, Vice President Rob Ainsley, our President, they've committed, and this board is committed to looking at every single policy from a culturally responsive, inclusive, and loving lens. So they determined the criteria, and now they're going to the community and say, we're going to change these policies because the institutional oppression that we say we want to eradicate has been written into our policies. It's not a bug in our systems, these inequities. It is a feature, and it's featured in the policies that are on our books. So our board has led with that being the what happened, and now they're engaging in the self-reflection and conflict that is needed to change it. So you can't skip steps. This board did not just say, we're going to change the code of conduct policy. because it needs to be changed to produce more equity. No, they talked about why do we have a code of conduct? Let's even talk about why do we call it a code? You know, there's a penal code and then a code of conduct. See any correlations? So a board just having reflections about why does this policy exist, and then engaging in the conflict. So if we were to say we won't suspend anyone anymore, what would that look like? See, that's constructive conflict. See, as we say often, the conflict is inevitable. The combat is optional. And now this is where our boards are needed now more than ever, to lead that community conversation where people aren't running out of the room with their hair on fire, but instead engaging in real dialogue that will result in a policy changing, where the words before that spoke to oppression literally jumped off the page for us when we do the real reflection work, and changing those words and those phrases and those policies to produce inequities, to produce equity, I'm sorry, to eradicate inequities and produce equity.
Right, right. Because you're talking about policy, I just want to reiterate once again the great work that our policy team did to do exactly what you're saying, is to really look and propose that our boards and our districts look at their policy through the lens of equity, and do that across the board, really. And I think that's a really important first step. And just in doing that, you raise people's awareness and you build a dialogue and a narrative that shifts and changes. So that is a very, very important step. I wanted to also ask you what you think about creating or revisiting the district vision, the district mission, the visionary goals for the district. Have any of you had any conversations with your Board of Education to take a look at those things through the lens of equity?
We certainly have. We have been doing this for quite some time now. And if you look at our district goals, they speak very much to all the things that we've been talking about here. And that comes from the fundamental premise that if these are the goals, if these are the things that drive our actions, subsequently, we define the outcome that we want and ask ourselves, what are the steps that we need to take to realize those outcomes? And it's driven by our goals and our essential objectives. So that's truly where, from a board perspective, there's an important piece. And it's important conversations that boards must have. Because I just want to piggyback a little bit on even the comment that Michael made before, that in so many cases, we have districts and people that are prisoners of past assumptions. You know, oh, we have always done it this way syndrome. And part of that comes in with boards of education needing to accept responsibility. And what I mean by that is people being honest about their own private racial beliefs. Because when you think about it, we can have all these processes in place, but if people aren't honest about their own private racial beliefs that lend to biases, prejudice, and discriminatory actions, all those things are just a great academic exercise that only yields more frustration for those who are impacted or those who want to make a positive impact. So we have to think about those kind of things. We have to think about the messaging. And back to your question about goals, what's the messaging that you get from looking at your respective goals? You know, everybody has cute mission statements, but they're cute. The question is, how do those translate to actions that addresses the disenfranchising outcomes that we see in our schools? And that then requires truly and honestly that boards of education, that superintendents, that educators, that we interrogate our own thinking. We have to interrogate our own thinking. You know, it's easy to think that other people experience the world that we do the way that we do, but most people don't. And so that's also part of when we establishing our goals, we have to interrogate our thinking. Why do I think this statement is applicable versus that statement, something that Michael alluded to before? And so that comes with assessing our biases, addressing our blind spots, and truly on the other side of it too is being able to digest critical feedback. When people say it's not working for me, we need to hear and listen and understand what that is, because there's almost kind of like a miasma that happens within organizational culture. People know that it stinks like hell, but no one wants to admit where the stench is coming from. And because the minute you admit to that, that means someone has to be held accountable to make that change. And so it's easy to ignore the stench or to get used to it than to address it. And so that's why this conversation is important in one step, but it's about how do we go to institutionalize the work. And it's not about the singular Black person in your organization becomes a point person on diversity and inclusivity. It's about everyone's responsibility. And certainly I can speak to my school board at Shen. They have embraced it, and I give them credit. Even last night we had a board meeting, they were having the conversations. And I went home and my daughter said, Dad, how was the board meeting? I was kind of like, Gigi, it's so funny. Finally, and I'm hoping my board member's not offended by what I said. I was like, finally, I got white people finally taking this stuff seriously. That's I'm just being absolutely as candid as you can, because at the end of the day, we could talk about this forever, but until people who right now control the influence embrace the need for change and start contributing to that change, it's simply going to lend to more frustration for everyone at the end of the day. So that's why it's about, because it's not just about asking what the important question. It's about listening. It's about suspending our judgments. It's about engaging in that deep introspection about who are we? Who am I as a person? My board president last night, Deanna Stevenson, said it. She was like, I'm my own personal learning journey. I need to become a better me before I can start asking people, how can I help them? I have to be on my own personal learning journey. And we know that's an uncomfortable journey, but we can't take shortcuts. There's no panacea. There's no right answer. There's no singular summit that you go to, a webinar that you go to, you have all the right answers. It's a personal journey that as board members, we need to be on in order to effectively do this work to change the fabric of our institutions.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson. So, one of the key things you said that I heard was, we need to interrogate our own thinking. And that is the journey, that is the personal reflection and awareness that, we all should take up on. And when I said earlier, everybody can get behind this issue or this need for us to become more aware of our own personal journey, I think that's for the good of all of our kids in the district. And Mark and I do, among some of our other staff, board retreats, and we do 100 or more almost every year. And we hear a lot of what our board members talk about, what their community, what's important to them in their community. And we know that each and every one of them get on the board. They run for the board for the kids. They always say that like 99.9% of the time, I ran for the kids because the kids in my community are important to me. And if they think and believe that the kids are important and all the kids are important, the outcomes, like you said, for all kids to be successful, what does that need to look like? They need to, or perhaps are going to be compelled or inspired to do that journey where they interrogate their own thinking, that journey where they might communicate to their community members why it's important for all of us to interrogate our own thinking when it comes to this issue of equitable education and how we might do a better job at doing that. But what are some of the other things that you would want to, you've had some conversations with your board, but if you were to say to our listeners today, what are the kinds of conversations you want to have with your Board of Education that would help them shift and make the change? Yes, you have to be aware. You have to really interrogate your thinking. That's the personal journey. But what are some of the other things that they might be able to pay attention to or execute to really help make a difference? Anybody, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Again, everything must start with self-reflection, whether it's a development session with the board, a board meeting, one-on-one meetings with board members, and then the community, and then staff. But it starts with self-reflection. And we've used the word culture a lot. And it's important for board members, governance teams, to understand what is the culture of our school districts. Now, I've been asking that question for 20 plus years now as an administrator. And it hasn't been until recently where we've had an authentic and real conversation about what is the culture of our school districts. And as we think about it, I think we all could agree on this call that our school districts have been paternalistic. We know where the power where the power lies. They have been individualistic, competitive. Our cultures, there's a right to comfort that exists in our schools. There's a sense of urgency that exists in our schools. I could go on and on. I could probably list another 12 or 13, 14 characteristics. And when we look at the research about those characteristics, it will speak to supremacy culture, more specifically white supremacy culture. Now, if we are going to be reflective about the culture that exists in our schools and then say exactly what it is, I ask folks to then have that reflection, say what it is, and then look to see who runs out of the room. And in this community where I am, we've been able to engage in that conversation, and I've been able to stand up publicly and say, we are an organization, we are a school district that are institutionally racist because we're built on white supremacy culture. Now, what are we going to do about it? And we know that the antidote to supremacy culture is love. You know, the antidote to a sense of urgency is patience. That's one of our key loving principles. The antidote to a right to comfort is trust. I mean, that's playing out right now. Folks don't want to come back into our buildings because they don't feel comfortable. They feel like they have a right to being comfortable. And we, a governance team, we respond with, you know, trust us. We'll get the filters in. Our HVAC systems will be good. So I would just say, you know, it all starts with reflection, and our governance teams can lead a community in a conversation about who is it that we are and what has resulted because of that culture, and then what will be the antidote to that culture if we're looking to change. And for us, we've defined it as love.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's I think one of the most important reasons why we're all alive, right? And I think, you know, that speaks to, when I think about the culture or the climate within the school building itself, that does speak to me a lot about what are we creating, very intentionally trying to create within the building. And so that would involve the teachers and the staff and all our administrators and our kids and our parents, of course, who come and go. So when you think about what it is we have to change in terms of culture within the school building, are there any specific barriers that I mean, I know I've heard what you've said, but you know, what as a board member would I have to be mindful of as I'm supporting policy or supporting the budget, et cetera?
This culture of love is not a love fest. And I gotta say this, it's not natural. It's not the default place to be. This is hard, and it comes with some costs, both professional and personal costs. As we spent the last 11 years attempting to cultivate a culture of love, we've had to pay the price because it will look like us changing the very core of who we are as an organization. So the barrier is the culture. And to change that culture in a real way will cause folks to struggle. And, you know, no matter we'll hear it's never going to be about student achievement. It's always going to be about something else that the governance team and the superintendent isn't doing well. You know, Oliver, you've heard this one. They're making too much money all of a sudden, superintendent is, or they travel too much, or there's some other random controversy that will be created to get folks away from the real issues. You know, you can increase student achievement significantly, but when going after changing the culture to be more equitable, people are going to find all kinds of reasons for you not to be there anymore. And that's why, again, I'm so thankful for the safe space my board has provided me. But we've been in it. And Oliver and Michael, I would love to hear your thoughts about that. How popular is this conversation? And for me, the barrier is the culture that already exists. That's the biggest one.
So I appreciate that, Lavelle, and just Darcy, just to piggyback a little bit on that. And again, I'm also speaking for the experience, 16 years being here at Shenandoah and seeing the evolution of the district, evolution of the board, evolution of the community. And while we've seen tremendous growth, we've also seen constant reminders of those things that must change in order for us to have a truly harmonious society. And so the work is always there, right? The hatred is always, I used to say it's looming right under the surface, but quite frankly, it's often right in our faces as we speak. And so I think it was Elie Wiesel that made a quote that says the opposite of love isn't hate, it's indifference. And so what board members cannot be is indifferent. And that's such a vital piece, because often you hear people say, well, you know what, okay, I'm not against, I'm not for, I'm just going to be neutral about it. Well, just quite frankly, that's the worst place that you can be quite honestly, I'd rather you take a position. At least I know where you're coming from, and subsequently we could then start to define where we need to go. But that indifference is a place that I would say board members be cognizant of that, and that often comes from people being uncomfortable to lean into the uncomfortable conversations. If these conversations were easy, the problems would have been solved. These are uncomfortable conversations, and so we have to be uncomfortable with the silences, with the awkwardness of exchanges, and we have to recognize that again, back to what I said before, that we have to listen, not necessarily to react, but listen to appreciate, to understand, and then use that then to assess our own lens on how we view the world, how the world views us, and so those things become so important, because what we're talking about here are in many ways things that people can view almost as innate behaviors. Things that when you think about it, people, you say, why do you go to a particular church? Well, because that was my grandmother's church. You never really thought about it. You just kind of did it. Why do you do certain things? Because it's been out, whatever. Just kind of did it. And basically, this is about now undoing those things. And I want to punctuate the point that it's not about unknowing. You notice I said undoing. Undoing meaning taking different actions. You still know it, but you're taking a different action. And so it's not about unknow, but when you know something else, now you have a choice to make. So you probably could know what was wrong and what was going wrong, but now you know something else. Now you have a choice to make. And so that's a big part of that, leaning into that uncomfortable, to listen, to appreciate. And it's not just listening to hear, listening to internalize, to analyze, and then you form a perspective that lends to actions. And that has to be a collective responsibility for the entire board to take on. It can't be a one woman and one man show, because it has to be a collective work and responsibility of the entire governance body if they're truly serious about creating environments where our schools are truly sanctuaries for our young people.
Great point. Great
I couldn't have
point.
said it better myself.
I know. I was just going to ask you that, Michael. From your perspective as a board member, what do you think?
I think really and truly what has to happen is board members need to again be uncomfortable, but in being uncomfortable, I think they need to go out and seek knowledge about how to go about this work. It's not easy. I spend half my time worrying about my board work and the other half worrying about my day job. But having been in corporate for my entire professional life, corporate America has been grappling with this for a number of years. HR and diversity areas of a lot of major corporations have increased their staff, tenfold in order to address the issue of educating employees, but also at the same time addressing employees that are unwilling to embrace this type of work in dealing with their coworkers. So I think it's finally coming home to the schools, public schools, that we need to do this work, and to do this work a lot better than what we've been doing. And what I've been saying to a lot of my northern school board members is folks in the South are toting that they're doing a lot better at this than we are. So I think we need to turn around and show them, who really does it best.
Thank you, Michael. So we have really just a few minutes left. I was wondering if, the three of you just wanted to punctuate, this webinar with a last comment or two. We'll start maybe with Dr. Robinson and Dr. Brown, and Michael, we'll let you pin it all up together for us. So Oliver, what do you think? Your last comment on this topic, what would you like to say?
So I'm going to use a piece from Frederick Douglass to kind of punctuate my point, and it's a piece that called Picture Makers. He said, poets and reformers, the secret to their power is that they see what ought to be by the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. Seeing what ought to be is a place where every young people thrive, every young people has a sense of agency, every young people has a sense of people caring and concern for them. And what is right now are all the disenfranchisement that we've been talking about. And now it's our commitment to remove those contradictions so we can realize what ought to be in our schools.
Thank you.
Wow. You know, I'm sitting here, I've never had an opportunity to go last or behind Oliver Robinson. He always gets the last word. So I'm going to just sit here and embrace this moment for a second and then share. You know, I lost my mother back in March at the beginning of this pandemic. And that was my hero. And, you know, she was a community icon where we live in Central Virginia. And the last thing she said to me was, make sure you get on that road. And I was by her side. She wasn't telling me to leave her side at that moment. She was telling me to stay on this authentic journey. See, there's a difference between the academic one and the authentic one. The academic one, you can be superintendent of the year like Oliver and I have been on the academic journey. You make people uncomfortable, but you really don't push them to struggle. You can change policies, i.e. the name of holidays. You know, we changed the name of Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day and we won. But the academic journey is not the authentic one, because the authentic one looks like us engineering opportunities for young people and communities to be agents for social change, every one of us. The authentic journey looks like us truly changing instructional practices in every single classroom, not just in pockets. The authentic journey looks like us surviving the changing of policies that we know are institutionally oppressive. I'm on the authentic journey. And as my mama also taught me is that, you know, people on the authentic journey typically don't survive it. I know I won't probably survive being superintendent on this journey, but what I hope I've done is inspire somebody to take my place when I'm gone.
Mm. Thank you, Lavelle. Michael?
So it's even tougher, I think, for me to go last after, you know, these two phenomenal guys. But I just want to again thank the sponsor, thank NYSSBA for allowing me to, you know, a couple of years back petition the General Assembly at the General Assembly meeting to make sure that, you know, from now or from back in 2017 or 2016, that at least someone of color will always sit at the table to have conversations, important conversations with the New York State School Board Association Board of Directors. So I'd like to thank them for that opportunity. I'd just like to, you know, just reiterate to board members out there that this work is very important. Board governance should not be taken lightly. It should not be, you should not have an indifferent attitude to the work that you're doing, because the work that you're doing is critical to the survival of our state and our country and our global economy. Our students are right now via social media global, but our classrooms are not. Our classrooms aren't reflective of, you know, their lives. And we are putting or have policies and procedures in place that don't celebrate them and don't show the appreciation that we should for our students. So I'd just like to, again, you know, implore board members that are not having these difficult and authentic conversations to start them. Feel uncomfortable, be comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, because it's a long journey. It's not something that's achieved overnight. And reach out for support. There's a tremendous amount of support across the state through a ton of different agencies out there where you're not having to reinvent the wheel. So that would be my parting words for my fellow school board members across the state. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So in closing today, I think this has just been a phenomenal discussion. I have thoroughly enjoyed it myself, and I think it really has helped us and our audience to identify not only what equity and inclusivity means, but we've also identified perhaps what's needed to positively impact equity and inclusivity in education by much of what has been said on this call today. But we also want to make sure board members are intentionally, through the lens of equity, paying attention to what's in their budget, what's in their policies, what their curriculum looks like, what kinds of quality and diverse teachers and educators come into their building, or how they advocate or recruit those folks in, and what's a meaningful, safe and supportive, thriving school climate look like, and what are those meaningful community engagement activities, conversations, and advocacy work can you do to really make an impact? It's almost as if the Board of Education themselves aligned themselves around these things. They would be adopting something like a superpower, so to speak. And you know that you will be able to make a difference. And I think everybody here would believe that you could make a difference. So I want to invite you all to please look forward to our 2 next upcoming webinars in this series. The next one on institutional racism, and the final one on building a diverse workforce. You'll be hearing more about that in the days to come. Right now, I'd like to thank our special guests, Dr. Oliver Robinson, Dr. Louvel Brown, and Mr. Michael Jaime, for joining us today, as well as my colleagues, our Executive Director, Bob Schneider, and our Leadership Development, Mark Schneider. My name is Darcy Dercoli, Director of Leadership Development, and on behalf of the New York State School Boards Association, I want to say thank you so very much for joining us today. Thank you, everyone.